Every negotiation begins somewhere, but how do we know where we are when talks begin? Are we entering a stable system where shared interests, trust, and institutions are aligned? Or are we stepping into a process already sliding toward fragmentation and crisis? This framework maps the dynamics of conflict and negotiation through 11 interconnected triads. Each triad captures a specific pattern in how interests, trust, and institutions interact. Together, they trace the life cycle of cooperation and breakdown, from the quiet stability of starting alignment, to the feedback loops of divergent priorities, to the rising tensions that drive conflict escalation and institutional paralysis. Along the way, we explore how domestic pressures and international shocks intertwine, how coalitions fracture when shared meaning collapses, and why some crises force reluctant cooperation, even among rivals. At the heart of this framework is a simple idea. Systems don't fail all at once, and they don't recover all at once either. They shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, through recognizable stages. As we move into the later triads, we shift from understanding breakdown to understanding recovery. We see why building an agenda, restoring trust, and ensuring participation must happen together if summit diplomacy is going to work. We learn why even the best designed agreements fail without legitimacy, and why implementation often collapses quietly, long after the cameras leave. Finally, we face the critical question: does the system embed its progress and adapt for the future, or does it fall back into cycles of mistrust and rivalry? These triads don't offer simple answers. What they provide is a map, a way to see where a system stands, where it might be heading, and where negotiators and policymakers can intervene before small disruptions cascade into full-blown crises. If we understand the patterns, we can better anticipate risks, manage escalation, and create the conditions for lasting agreements in an increasingly unstable world. Every negotiation begins with a question: where is the starting alignment? Before talks even begin, the stability of the system depends on three forces working together: shared interests, mutual trust, and institutional stability. When these three are aligned, cooperation is almost effortless. Expectations are clear, frameworks are predictable, and informal coordination does the work long before summits or formal agreements are necessary. But this balance is fragile because the three elements are mutually reinforcing. If one begins to weaken, the others follow. A small loss of trust can erode confidence in institutions. A failing framework can fracture shared interests. Diverging priorities can quickly spiral into declining stability. And if two elements fail at once, the system doesn't simply weaken, it collapses, forcing actors into formal negotiations because the old informal mechanisms no longer work. In its healthiest state, this triad is symmetrical and reciprocal. Shared interests foster trust. Trust reinforces stable institutional behavior. Institutions, in turn, codify those interests and signal reliability back into the system. None dominates the others. Their strength lies in their simultaneous activation. When all three are aligned, small disruptions are absorbed. A policy drift here, a procedural misstep there. The other two forces dampen the shock, allowing the system to self-correct. However, the same tight interdependence that creates this stability also makes the system brittle. Once one node falters significantly, the pressure shifts rapidly to the others, amplifying risks instead of buffering them. The breakdown doesn't unfold gradually, it cascades. Subtle warning signs often appear: first stalled decisions, minor procedural irregularities, softening compliance. If those signals are ignored, the transition from informal alignment to open fracture can happen almost overnight. So pay attention not just to outcomes, but to the balance between the three forces. Are interests aligned? Are expectations being met reliably enough to sustain trust? Are institutions functioning as stabilizers or slipping into irrelevance? The health of this starting alignment sets the tone for everything that follows, because when it holds, diplomacy is quiet and frictionless. When it fails, escalation is inevitable. The first cracks in a negotiation rarely appear as open confrontation. They often emerge quietly, through shifts in priorities, tone, or framing. What looks like a small difference in goals can unsettle expectations, erode trust, and weaken institutions. This stage is not yet a crisis, but it signals that the system has entered a loop of reinforcing disruption. At first, nothing seems broken. The mechanisms are still in place, talks continue, and institutions still function. But beneath the surface, a loop of reinforcing disruption begins. As objectives drift apart, trust erodes. As trust erodes, institutions lose credibility, and as institutions falter, divergence deepens in turn. This is the danger of recursive instability. Small cracks amplify one another. What begins as a narrow policy disagreement can trigger broader mistrust, which then spills into institutional decay. Each disruption magnifies the next, making it harder to resolve problems informally. By the time tensions become visible, the underlying system has already shifted from resilience to vulnerability. The triggers for divergence are often diverse: domestic political pressures, shifting economic imperatives, or external shocks, but their effects are consistent. As shared interests weaken, the trust built on them begins to fail. That loss of trust undermines the institutions meant to manage cooperation, eroding their procedural authority or making them outright obsolete. And once institutions falter, they stop buffering disputes and start accelerating them, feeding the same drift that caused the problem in the first place. From the outside, the system may still appear intact at this stage. Summits are announced, mechanisms remain active, but appearances deceive. The feedback loop is already in motion, steadily degrading the system's ability to self-correct. Talks become performative. Institutions, instead of mediating disagreements, become arenas for contestation. If these early cracks go unaddressed, the cycle hardens into incompatible strategic visions, leaving actors unable to agree even on basic goals. This stage demands close attention to direction, not just intensity. Are priorities subtly diverging or converging? Are institutions still credible enough to stabilize expectations, or are they becoming contested ground? Is trust recovering after disruptions, or is each misstep feeding the next? Left unchecked, this loop rarely resolves itself. Once divergence reaches a certain point, escalation becomes not just likely but systemic, locking actors into patterns that are increasingly difficult to reverse without external intervention or deliberate procedural resets. At some point, quiet divergence turns into open competition. Once actors begin actively contesting resources, influence, or security, the system enters the escalation phase. Here, the logic shifts. The goal is no longer simple management, but leverage. Competition drives maneuvering, maneuvering amplifies risk, and each reactive move tightens the spiral. At this stage, negotiators must shift focus toward containment, signaling discipline and establishing de-escalatory channels, because even small missteps can trigger rapid systemic shock. Escalation unfolds through a causal chain. Scarcity, whether real or perceived, pushes actors towards zero-sum calculations. That scarcity drives aggressive or defensive maneuvers, military deployments, trade restrictions, diplomatic pressure, that in turn magnify systemic risk. The more actors maneuver, the more brittle the system becomes, as every move is interpreted as a threat or a test. Are competitive moves calculated or reactive? Are signals clear and disciplined or ambiguous and provocative? Are communication channels still open enough to manage misunderstandings, or are they narrowing? These are the signs that tell you whether negotiation space still exists, or whether strategic inertia is already closing it off. This is where tensions that once seemed manageable tip into volatility. Resolution is no longer just about returning to prior alignment. Even if the immediate competition is resolved, the habits of escalation linger. Strategic inertia and accumulated risk reshape the environment, making it harder to simply rewind the system to where it stood before. What makes this stage especially dangerous is its asymmetry. Escalation flows predictably forward, but reversing it is not enough. Ending the resource competition does not erase the defensive postures, hardened mistrust, or amplified risks it has already produced. The damage lingers, and even low-level competition can reignite the full triad if safeguards are weak. Once escalation begins, actors often feel trapped. Withdrawal appears costlier than confrontation, even when the opposite is true. That sense of entrapment locks parties into brittle strategies where miscalculation is only a step away. In this phase, preparation matters as much as position. Negotiators must anticipate how each action will be read by others and factor in the risks of misperception. Stability now depends on slowing the chain before it locks in. Once escalation takes hold, each step forward limits the options for recovery, and the window for preventing crisis begins to shrink. Sometimes a negotiation stalls not because anyone chooses confrontation, but because the system stops moving. In this triad, three forces feed into one another: domestic paralysis, where formal decision-making structures slow or stop, environmental uncertainty, where planning becomes difficult because no one knows what will hold, and international deadlock, where cross-border negotiations freeze while everyone waits for clarity. Breakdown rarely begins with a dramatic collapse. It often starts quietly: missed deadlines, delayed meetings, small procedural workarounds meant to bypass gridlock at home. These small gaps widen uncertainty in the broader environment. Partners lose confidence in timelines and commitments, and as uncertainty spreads, it becomes harder for international forums to act. Chairs delay calling votes, agendas stall, and negotiators begin holding positions rather than moving them forward. The challenge here is that the links are indirect and lagged. By the time international deadlock is visible, the underlying paralysis has usually been in place for some time, and environmental uncertainty has already taken root. Institutions may still look intact on paper, press releases go out, communiques are published, but if decisions aren't emerging on time or with clear follow-through, the breakdown has already begun. This is where negotiators need to focus less on outcomes and more on process health. Are domestic decisions arriving later than usual? Are temporary workarounds becoming permanent? Are forecasts or risk assessments getting wider and less reliable with each cycle? Are external counterparts increasingly asking for clarifications or shifting to informal side channels? These are the early signals that the system is stalling, even before it's obvious at the surface. Once breakdown locks in, it tends to cascade. Domestic paralysis fuels uncertainty, uncertainty drives international hesitation, and hesitation deepens paralysis further. Reversing that spiral means starting early. Stabilize domestic decision-making wherever you can, publish clear timelines, unify procedural rules, and ensure outputs are credible and explainable. Contain uncertainty by narrowing commitments and sticking to deliverables you can defend. On the international side, focus agendas on items with quick feedback cycles and create fallback mechanisms that keep some momentum even when deadlines slip. At this stage, the goal isn't solving every problem at once, it's restoring enough movement to keep the system breathing. If you wait until the deadlock is fully visible, you've already lost most of your room to maneuver. What happens when domestic unrest and international tensions stop feeding separately and start feeding each other? This is the stage where pressures combine across scales. Internal political strains push governments toward harder lines. Those hardline moves invite international backlash, and that backlash, instead of easing pressure, rebounds into domestic instability, fueling the cycle all over again. At this point, escalation is no longer straightforward or one-directional. It is recursive and socially amplified. Every node of the system reinforces the others. Domestic politics inflame international reactions. International reactions harden domestic positions, and the cycle closes back on itself. The result is a loop that feels harder to interrupt with every turn. The challenge here is that stabilizing one part of the system is no longer enough. A government may moderate its domestic stance, but if international actors escalate demands, compromise collapses. External restraint may buy time, but without internal reform, pressure resurfaces. The structure punishes partial fixes. Unless efforts are coordinated across all fronts, domestic, international, and communicative, instability intensifies rather than recedes. So what should negotiators be watching for? Look at whether domestic debates are being pulled into international arenas. Are external responses amplifying internal divides rather than calming them? Are efforts at compromise in one sphere being undone by pressure in another? These are signs the cycle has become inclusive in its breakdown. Each part feeds the rest, and no single intervention holds without reinforcement from the others. This is why summits often become the last resort in this phase. Only at that level can pressures be absorbed and redirected across multiple domains at once. But even that window narrows quickly once the cycle accelerates. The longer the loop runs unchecked, the more each actor, domestic or international, is drawn deeper into it, until normal governance and ordinary diplomacy are no longer enough to stabilize the system. Here the lesson is simple, but unforgiving. Coordination is everything. Interventions must work in concert, dampening pressures symmetrically. If even one actor escalates while the others hold back, the loop reignites. Without synchronized relief, this triad produces runaway instability that can overwhelm even strong institutions. What happens when it's no longer just that priorities diverge, but the actors stop agreeing on what's even being negotiated. This is the point where consensus bottlenecks, coalitions collapse, agendas misalign, and narratives drift so far apart that the shared political architecture holding the system together begins to break down. Without a common frame of reference, even well-designed talks stall, not because positions are irreconcilable, but because the language of negotiation itself stops working. The problem here isn't simply disagreement over outcomes, it's a breakdown of legitimacy and coherence. Actors lose trust not just in each other's commitments, but in each other's definitions of the problem. One side's solution sounds irrelevant, or even provocative, to the other, because the frameworks of meaning have drifted too far apart. Over time, these gaps deepen into epistemic fracture. Technical dialogue becomes meaningless because the parties no longer agree on basic terms, roles, or responsibilities. This bottleneck usually begins with coalition failure. As blocks fracture, shared positions dissolve, forcing actors to improvise narratives and strategies. Those improvised positions diverge, reinforcing mistrust and accelerating fragmentation. But coalitions aren't just a symptom here, they're also the glue. When they fail, they take with them the informal coordination that made negotiations possible, and what was once a single table splinters into parallel, disconnected conversations. For negotiators, the danger is that fragmentation spreads across domains. A breakdown in one area, say trade talks, spills into unrelated files like security or climate cooperation, making it harder to maintain alignment anywhere. And unlike in Triad 5, where instability loops are amplified by escalating pressures, here the driver is the loss of connective tissue, the frameworks, shared narratives, and decision structures that make negotiation intelligible in the first place. The early warning signs are subtle but critical. Our working groups struggling to agree on agenda wording or baseline assumptions. Our coalitions shifting faster than their mandates can update. Our actors increasingly referencing incompatible facts or appealing to different legitimacy frameworks altogether. If so, the system may already be in epistemic drift, where each attempt to resolve disputes creates more confusion than clarity. When consensus bottlenecks, forcing movement often backfires. Pushing through an agenda without shared framing can harden divisions rather than resolve them. The better path is to rebuild coherence first. Narrow the scope of talks to areas where minimal agreement still exists, invest in clarifying terms and definitions, and re-anchor the process around legitimacy structures everyone still recognizes. Without this reset, negotiation becomes performative, the appearance of dialogue, without the capacity for resolution. What does it take to bring adversaries back to the same table when trust is gone and positions are hardened? Sometimes, honestly, it isn't goodwill or alignment, it's pressure. This is the moment when rising vulnerabilities and escalating risks grow so severe that actors can no longer ignore their interdependence. Crises reach a threshold where no one can manage them alone and, well, reluctant convergence becomes possible. But here's the key. This cooperation isn't voluntary, it's compelled. Shared vulnerabilities like economic collapse, environmental shocks, or security failures combine with high-stakes risks to create enough pressure that even rivals must seek minimal common ground. For negotiators, this is the opportunity, but also the challenge. The opening is fragile, and unless it's used well, the same pressures driving convergence today can push the system into deeper fragmentation tomorrow. The structure here is harmonic. Two escalating forces can pull the third into engagement, but if anyone is missing, the alignment collapses. If actors see their vulnerabilities clearly and recognize the scale of the risks, even thin zones of shared concern emerge. But if either exposure or urgency goes unacknowledged, coordination stalls. That's why the work of the negotiator shifts at this stage. It's not enough to manage the crisis. You have to connect the crises. Actors must see how their issues are linked, how each problem is amplifying the others, and why piecemeal solutions will fail. This is often where talks succeed or fail. Without an integrative frame, parties focus on protecting narrow interests, treating each issue in isolation. But in crisis-driven harmonization, isolation is the illusion. Security tensions destabilize markets. Market shocks intensify migration flows. Migration stress triggers domestic political backlash, which closes doors to cooperation elsewhere. If negotiators can surface these links, they turn reluctant urgency into a shared recognition that the stakes are systemic, not just local. Watch for three things at this threshold: whether actors are acknowledging their shared vulnerabilities, whether they agree on the scale and immediacy of the risks, and whether discussions are siloed or integrative. When parties see how one crisis deepens another, even limited trust becomes less relevant. The pressure itself compels procedural engagement. But this window is narrow. If actors can't connect the dots, the opportunity collapses and risks compound. Minimal cooperation achieved under duress will not last on its own. The lesson here is simple but demanding. Diffusing conflict requires reframing it. By helping parties see the interlocking pressures shaping their behavior, negotiators can turn crisis into a catalyst, not just for temporary convergence, but for sustained engagement before the next escalation takes hold. Once crises push actors toward reluctant engagement, the challenge shifts. How do you convert urgency into a workable framework for negotiations? This is the stage of agenda formation, where momentum must be carefully stabilized and directed. Progress depends on three elements moving together: clear issue prioritization, rebuilding trust, and credible participation guarantees. This is a phase of fragile momentum. If agendas move faster than trust, actors suspect bad faith and disengage. If trust-building advances but priorities remain undefined, the process feels performative. And if key participants hesitate or withdraw, nothing else matters. Negotiators are no longer simply managing tensions. They're choreographing movement across all three dimensions at once, ensuring that none outruns the others. The dynamic here is convergent. Each node depends on and reinforces the others. Clear agendas only hold meaning if parties trust that negotiations are genuine, and if everyone critical to implementation commits to show up. Trust, in turn, cannot deepen without substantive issues to work toward, and it collapses if key actors refuse to participate. Likewise, no one commits to a summit if the agenda lacks relevance or the process lacks credibility. Breakdowns here almost always arise from synchronization failures. When negotiators define ambitious agendas before rebuilding confidence, divisions harden rather than soften. When trust-building efforts race ahead without substantive clarity, actors perform cooperation without committing to outcomes. And participation without both trust and defined issues is hollow. It produces summits that fail before they begin. This structure makes agenda formation one of the most delicate stages in diplomacy. It's not linear, and it's not modular. It is relational. Progress in one area can unlock movement in others, but neglect in any one domain undermines the whole. For negotiators, the work is less about driving one priority forward and more about aligning tempos so that agendas, trust, and participation evolve together. That's why mismatched expectations are so dangerous. A single actor pushing too far, too fast, whether by announcing a bold summit agenda or signaling conditional participation, can destabilize the fragile convergence forming beneath the surface. In this phase, ambition without synchronization backfires. The task is balance. Move deliberately enough to build credibility, but fast enough to capitalize on the rare opening that crisis harmonization created. Summits don't fail at the table, they fail here, in the quiet choreography of convergence. Negotiators who succeed understand that agenda formation is not just about defining issues. It's about synchronizing trust, participation, and priorities so that the summit itself becomes inevitable rather than aspirational. This is where everything becomes visible. The summit stage is the culmination of months, sometimes even years of preparation, but it's also the most brittle phase of diplomacy. Negotiators now face the challenge of synchronizing three essentials at once: political will, workable technical solutions, and public legitimacy. If even one is missing, the entire negotiation risks failure. Ask yourself, are leaders truly prepared to make concessions? Are the solutions on the table implementable under current constraints? And will the outcome survive contact with domestic politics and public opinion? At the summit stage, these aren't separate questions. They are interdependent, and missing anyone undermines the others. This is the unforgiving logic of summit diplomacy. 2 out of 3 is failure. Political will and technical solutions without legitimacy invite backlash and rejection. Legitimacy and solutions without leadership produce stalling and ambiguity. Political will and legitimacy without workable plans reduce the summit to symbolism, gestures without traction. Negotiators can't afford to assume that strength in one domain compensates for weakness in another. It just doesn't. The pressure here is binary. Success requires the full combination, political authority, functional design, and societal validation, or the entire structure unravels. That's why summit preparation is not about improvisation, it's about integration. The work must be done before negotiators enter the room, aligning stakeholders, stress testing solutions, and preparing leaders to defend compromises publicly. Another danger lies in timing. Legitimacy almost always lags. Domestic publics and excluded actors rarely move as fast as negotiators want them to. A deal signed without public grounding risks immediate rejection or backlash. Likewise, an elegant technical framework without political champions dies quietly in implementation. For negotiators, the takeaway is clear. The summit stage is not where gaps are resolved, it's where they're exposed. Partial alignment looks like progress but functions like failure. Durable agreements depend on arriving with all three pillars in place, synchronized and defensible. Without that, even a signed deal can collapse before the ink is dry. The summit may feel like the finish line, but for negotiators, it's the starting point of a much harder phase. The ink on the agreement doesn't secure outcomes, implementation does. At this stage, the focus shifts from reaching consensus to ensuring operational integrity. Three elements must move together: clear agreement design, real resource commitments, and credible enforcement mechanisms. Without all three aligned, the structure weakens, and the breakdown usually begins quietly. Ask yourself, is the agreement precise enough to guide action? Are the promised resources actually committed, budgeted, and deployable? And are there mechanisms in place to monitor compliance and deter defection? If the answer to anyone is no, the risks compound. This is where many diplomatic victories unravel. Well-written agreements without funding stall in bureaucracy. Resource pledges without enforcement invite opportunism. And even strong oversight fails if the agreement itself lacks clarity, leaving space for actors to reinterpret, delay, or resist. The Triad teaches a simple but unforgiving lesson. Design, resources, and enforcement must reinforce each other. Implementation also introduces a sequencing trap. Enforcement mechanisms often depend on design clarity and material commitments, but enforcement itself must be in place early enough to deter defection. Get the timing wrong, and hidden weaknesses will surface downstream, when reversing course is far harder. Likewise, resourcing too late or too lightly undermines early compliance, producing cascading skepticism about the deal's viability. This is not just a procedural challenge, it's structural. Implementation crosses functional silos. Policy, finance, law, and diplomacy all intersect here. If one arm lags, the others falter. Negotiators must therefore think systemically, anticipating how shortfalls in one domain ripple across the others. Durable agreements emerge when all three elements, design, resources, enforcement, are associated tightly enough that progress in any one reinforces the rest. Success here depends on constant vigilance. Implementation failures rarely arrive as open crises. They accumulate slowly as commitments slip, mechanisms erode, and trust dissipates. By the time disputes resurface, the damage is often baked in. Negotiators must treat follow-through as an active system, not a passive afterthought. Every gap, every delay, every underfunded pledge, every weak monitoring tool invites the re-emergence of the very conflicts the summit was meant to resolve. This is the hinge point. By the time negotiations reach this stage, the question is no longer about signing deals or launching initiatives. It's about whether the system itself can absorb change and carry it forward. The challenge for negotiators is to weave together three imperatives: building institutions that embed agreements, sustaining trust through visible compliance, and preparing the system for shocks we can't yet see. Without integration across all three, every hard-won gain risks dissolving, and the entire cycle resets. Ask yourself, have today's solutions been locked into durable structures? Will trust still hold once the next crisis tests it? And are our systems prepared for risks we haven't faced yet? These questions are not optional at this stage. They define whether we stabilize or spiral back toward escalation. The trap here is false security. Institutions can exist on paper while quietly eroding in practice. Trust can appear high but collapse under the first unanticipated shock. And elaborate scenario planning can fail without concrete anchors in policy and resources. Each node supports the other two or undermines them. Institutions without trust are brittle shells. Preparedness without structural grounding produces fragmented responses. Trust without either framework or foresight dissolves when the next disruption hits. This triad is the system's gatekeeper. Success here means transforming temporary agreements into living architecture, frameworks capable of adapting, coordinating, and holding actors accountable over time. Integration produces system memory. Lessons from one crisis are institutionalized and reused, reducing the risk of reliving the same failures. Preparedness embedded in real structures generates resilience instead of scrambling. Trust, nurtured continuously, reinforces the entire cycle. But failure at this stage has consequences that cascade backward. If institutionalization falters or preparedness lags, trust erodes. Without trust, institutions lose legitimacy. Without adaptive planning, future shocks break through old safeguards. And once the scaffolding gives way, escalation dynamics return, forcing actors to start again at divergence, fragmentation, and confrontation. For negotiators, the message is clear. This stage demands a shift from transactional to systemic thinking. It's not enough to resolve the dispute at hand. The work is to embed agreements so deeply that they survive leadership changes, political cycles, and shifting geopolitical pressures. The goal is to turn momentary alignment into enduring resilience. If integration succeeds, summits evolve into self-sustaining regimes rather than recurring crisis management. If it fails, we repeat the loop, with less trust, weaker institutions, and a shorter fuse each time. The future of the system hinges here. Across these 11 triads, we've traced the arc of destabilization, from early divergence and rising competition through escalation, breakdown, and summit diplomacy, all the way to the final hinge between integration and collapse. The lesson is that crises don't erupt suddenly, they compound. Small misalignments grow into entrenched divides. Pressures at one level, domestic, international, or environmental, reverberate through the others, accelerating instability. By the time negotiators reach the visible stages of summitry, the system is already carrying the weight of accumulated risks, institutional fragility, and eroded trust. Without recognizing these deeper dynamics, even the best-intentioned agreements falter under stresses they were never designed to manage. But the framework also shows where leverage exists. At every stage, there are opportunities to anticipate cascading pressures, connect seemingly separate issues, and build resilience before the system tips. Negotiators who can map these interdependencies, who understand not just what is being argued but how each pressure amplifies the next, gain the ability to act upstream rather than react downstream. The goal is not to eliminate friction, it is to prevent runaway spirals, to turn temporary alignments into enduring structures, and to embed flexibility for shocks yet to come. Success lies in seeing the negotiation not as an isolated event, but as a living system, one where early awareness, synchronized action, and sustained integration are the keys to avoiding the cycle of repeated crises.